Just moments before the cameras rolled at Royal Ascot, an urgent whisper rippled through the palace corridors. Princess Catherine would not appear. What could possibly force the future queen to shatter tradition so publicly? The monarchy froze in disbelief. Royal Ascot has always been more than just a horse race. It is a centuries-old ritual, a glittering stage where the monarchy affirms its bond with the people, a place where hats sparkle like crowns, and the royal box stands as a symbol of unshakable tradition. Every year, the family arrives in perfect formation, each smile rehearsed, every gesture designed to assure the world that all is well within the palace walls. But this morning, something felt different. The air was thick, with an almost imperceptible tension. As the crowds leaned over the barriers in eager anticipation, photographers adjusted their lenses, and bookmakers counted their takings. A quiet panic erupted behind the scenes. A messenger, flushed and breathless, slipped into the royal chambers to deliver the words no one was prepared to hear. Catherine would not be attending. Not because of the rain, nor because of illness, but for reasons that no one could explain. The shock was immediate and raw. King Charles, moments before stepping into view, was seen gripping the edge of a table, his knuckles white and jaw tight. Those nearby could see the sudden storm in his eyes, the kind of storm that protocol could no longer conceal. Queen Camilla leaned into him, whispering furiously, her fingers twisting the chain of her necklace as though trying to hold the pieces together. One aide dared to ask if they should issue a statement. Charles waved them away without a word. For the first time in years, the royal family's carefully choreographed facade began to falter. Staff exchanged nervous glances in the hallways. At one point, a senior footman muttered under his breath, "This isn't just an illness, it's something deeper." His words lingered in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Whispers among the staff suggested that Catherine's decision wasn't made overnight. Some claimed she'd been quietly laying the groundwork for weeks, keeping her plans from even her closest aides until the very last moment. Others insisted she'd spoken only to William, and that he had begged her not to go through with it. Whatever the truth, it was clear. This was not a simple absence. This was a calculated move. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the press smelled blood. Journalists traded theories like currency. Was it a health crisis? A marital rift? A rebellion against her in-laws? Headlines began to swirl even before the royal carriage doors opened, speculation rising with every passing minute. But as the stunned crowd waited and cameras turned toward the empty royal box, little did they know that Catherine's absence would unleash a chain of revelations nobody could contain. For years, Princess Catherine seemed to embody grace and loyalty, the flawless heir to the throne. But behind closed doors, the pressures were mounting, and something finally broke. In public, she remained the epitome of composure, her smile unwavering, her hands folded with effortless elegance. She walked carpets of tradition without faltering, always at William's side, always ready to fulfill her duty. Yet beneath that serene surface, cracks had been forming invisible to the public, but impossible to ignore for those closest to her. At recent engagements, those who watched closely noticed fleeting moments of unease, her gaze drifting into the distance, her replies shorter, her laugh subdued. In moments where she would once have been the most radiant figure in the room, she seemed smaller, more withdrawn, as though retreating from the very world that adored her. Those closest to the palace began whispering about her growing silence. At a state dinner weeks earlier, she reportedly left the table early, excusing herself with an expression that no longer bothered to mask the fatigue in her eyes. On another occasion, cameras captured her tightening her jaw during a conversation with King Charles, her lips barely moving as they exchanged words no one could hear. Insiders later revealed that the exchange was anything but cordial. According to sources, Catherine and the king had endured a heated argument just days before Ascot. One staff member, who claimed to have overheard their clash, described voices raised and doors shut firmly behind them, a rare breach of royal decorum. Even more troubling was a secret meeting with William that left both visibly shaken. One aide recounted finding them together late one evening, their heads bowed, the sound of muffled sobs echoing down the corridor. Another insider claimed to have heard Catherine utter a single chilling line as she left the room, "I won't be paraded this time." The remark carried a quiet defiance, loaded with meaning no one dared to unpack aloud. Those words marked a turning point, and for the first time, it became clear her decision to step away from Ascot wasn't about health or fatigue. It wasn't even about rebellion for its own sake. It was a calculated move, a refusal to play the role she'd been assigned without question. In her own quiet way, she was sending a message to the palace, to the public, perhaps even to William himself, that she would not remain silent if her dignity was at stake. But if this was a statement, what was she trying to say, and who exactly was she defying? The answers lay buried in months of escalating tensions. Beneath the glittering hats and polite smiles, the monarchy was splintering, and Catherine's decision at Ascot revealed just how deep the fracture had become. For years, the public was fed an image of unity, of a family bound by duty and tradition. But that illusion was already crumbling in private. What began as subtle tension between Catherine and Queen Camilla had grown into open defiance. The two women clashed repeatedly over their roles, their responsibilities, and most of all, their vision for what the monarchy should represent. Camilla clung fiercely to the ways of the past formalities and rigid protocol, while Catherine whispered of modernization, of reaching out to the people in ways the crown never had before. These disagreements bled into every corner of their lives. Behind the grand doors of the dining room, family dinners turned icy, with William and Charles caught in increasingly bitter exchanges. One aide confessed that even the youngest staff members learned to avoid entering the room when the family gathered, afraid of the sharp words that sometimes erupted when they believed no one was listening. Catherine, too, began withdrawing from ceremonial events, where Camilla was center stage, her absence more noticeable with each passing month. It was during one such occasion, a state ceremony, where Camilla stood before the cameras and Catherine was relegated to the shadows, that a trusted attendant overheard Catherine murmur, "I won't be humiliated again." These quiet humiliations, repeated over and over, became unbearable. Friends of the princess say she spent nights pacing, her mind racing, while her allies within the family urged her to take a stand before it was too late. Among those allies were individuals who themselves had been sidelined or silenced by the crown, and they encouraged her to make her feelings known. Ascot, they said, was her moment, the perfect stage upon which to declare that she was not simply an ornament in Camilla's version of the monarchy. And so, when she did not appear, it was not simply an act of defiance, but the culmination of months, perhaps years of quiet resistance, a silent protest against being ignored, dismissed, and forced into submission. But what none of them expected was the sheer panic it unleashed, because this rift, as personal and painful as it was, couldn't alone explain the terror that crossed the king's face, or the frantic whispers that followed. Yet even these personal rivalries couldn't explain the sheer fear in the palace's response, because lurking behind the glamour was an even darker secret. Why would the palace react with such urgency to a simple absence? Because Catherine's silence threatened to expose a secret the family could not afford to let slip. Whispers began circulating almost as soon as the announcement of her withdrawal from Ascot reached the press. Beneath the polite statements and carefully rehearsed smiles, insiders spoke of a document, one that Catherine had stumbled upon weeks earlier, hidden in the depths of the palace archives. According to those who claimed to know, it was no ordinary memo. Its contents, they said, carried the potential to unravel the very foundation the monarchy stood upon. The timing of her disappearance began to look less like an impulsive act of defiance, and more like a calculated strike. Staff members later confided that in the days leading up to Ascot, Catherine had grown uncharacteristically meticulous, requesting private meetings, sending messages through unofficial channels, even consulting with advisors no longer employed at the palace. One side claimed she was overheard on the phone telling someone, "They've left me no choice. If they force me, I'll tell them everything." That single line set off a wave of panic behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, sparking late-night phone calls and emergency meetings among senior royals. Then came the shredders. In the hours after Catherine's absence became public, several staff members reported seeing piles of papers being carted into the basement. The steady, metallic hum of documents being destroyed echoed through the palace corridors. What was being destroyed, and why, became the subject of fevered speculation among both staff and the press. Meanwhile, tensions boiled over between the communications office and the senior royals. Aides reportedly argued over how to contain the story, each faction determined not to bear the blame. Some suggested throwing a junior staffer under the bus. Others argued for silence, fearing that any comment would only inflame suspicions. But nothing could disguise the fear etched into every corner of the palace. More than one observer noted that the king's hands trembled as he signed documents that morning. Camilla, typically so poised, was overheard snapping at her lady-in-waiting that they were one headline away from ruin. Even William, caught between loyalty to his wife and his duty to the crown, seemed to retreat from public view entirely, unable or unwilling to face what came next. And yet, all of this chaos, all of this scrambling to erase and deny, hinted at something far larger, something Catherine had perhaps known all along. This was no mere family squabble. It was a battle, quiet but deadly, for control of the future. And her absence, so carefully staged, might have been the opening move in a war no one was ready to fight. But as the palace scrambled to control the narrative, Catherine herself was nowhere to be found, and her silence was deafening. While the world demanded answers, Princess Catherine had disappeared into the shadows. Even her closest aides were left guessing, and speculation reached a fever pitch. At first, the palace attempted to frame her absence as a private matter, offering nothing more than silence. But that silence only deepened the mystery. Early that morning, long before most of the household had stirred, Catherine slipped out of the palace gates with just a single aide at her side. Witnesses later recalled a dark car waiting for her, its engine already running, as she stepped inside without hesitation and vanished into the gray dawn. For a brief moment, the paparazzi caught sight of her vehicle heading north toward the outskirts of the city. But just as quickly, it disappeared from their lenses, taking an unexpected turn down a narrow road that led to a remote estate. An estate known only to a handful of insiders. No one saw her arrive. No one saw her leave. She seemed to dissolve into the quiet countryside, leaving nothing but questions in her wake. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was electric with panic. Family insiders described William as pale with rage, seen pacing the halls and clutching his phone, dialing her number over and over, with no response. His frustration boiled over when staff offered no explanation, and at least one observer claimed to have heard the echo of his voice breaking through the heavy doors as he demanded to know where she had gone. Then came the whispers of a secret meeting outside London with powerful critics of the monarchy, individuals who had long been at odds with the royal family and who now, it seemed, might have become her unlikely allies. Some said she had sought them out intentionally, determined to strengthen her position before the inevitable clash with the palace. Others insisted it was nothing more than a desperate flight, a way to escape the crushing weight of expectation and betrayal. But while the palace scrambled to craft a coherent narrative, the media erupted. Headlines screamed from every corner of the press: health crisis? Divorce imminent? Abdication in motion? Reporters speculate wildly, some pointing to her withdrawn demeanor in recent weeks as evidence of a deeper fracture, others suggesting she had left William altogether. And then, at the height of the frenzy, the palace issued a chilling statement, just a single line that did little to soothe anyone's fears. "We ask for privacy at this time. No explanation, no reassurance, nothing but a void that left the world to imagine the worst." Yet privacy was the one thing the palace could no longer protect, because within hours, leaks began to spill into the public eye. By nightfall, damning information began to surface. Secrets long buried now threatened to drag the monarchy into the storm Catherine had unleashed. What began as whispers on obscure blogs exploded into headlines that the palace could no longer contain. The first leak came in the form of a memo unsigned but unmistakably authentic, revealing a campaign of internal sabotage, meticulously designed to undermine Catherine's public standing. The document outlined coordinated efforts by senior staff to sideline her during key events, to diminish her visibility, and to quietly transfer her responsibilities elsewhere, all under the guise of modernizing the monarchy. The revelations did not stop there. Hours later, journalists obtained a string of emails exchanged between senior aides, coldly plotting to strip Catherine of her most cherished patronages. The messages spoke of her as a liability, her dedication mocked as overbearing and out of step with the king's vision. It became clear these moves were not simply spontaneous reactions, but calculated strikes to weaken her influence long before she made her stand. Then came the audio. A grainy yet unmistakable recording surfaced, allegedly captured during an intimate dinner at the palace, in which Queen Camilla's voice could be heard, mocking Catherine's demeanor and dismissing her efforts as nothing more than pageantry for the cameras. The clip, though brief, sent shockwaves through the public and media alike, tearing at the fragile image of solidarity the family had so desperately tried to maintain. Anonymous sources then added yet another layer to the growing scandal. Catherine, they claimed, had been given an ultimatum just days before Ascot. Either she would accept her diminishing role quietly and obey the dictates of the crown, or she would be erased, her influence extinguished, her legacy rewritten. One insider described the message as chilling in its clarity: yield or vanish. As the leaks mounted, so did the tension inside the palace. William, caught in an impossible position between his wife and his father, reportedly erupted during a closed-door meeting, slamming the door with such force it rattled the portraits lining the hall and shouting just one word that echoed through the corridors: enough. His breaking point became a symbol of how deep the wounds had become, a husband torn between two worlds that no longer seemed to belong to him. And outside those gates, the public began to choose sides. Social media erupted in fury, the hashtags demanding justice for Catherine trending worldwide within hours. Messages of solidarity poured in from every corner, painting her as the victim of an archaic institution, clinging desperately to its own survival. The support was overwhelming, and yet Catherine herself stayed utterly silent, her absence more commanding than any speech could have been. But even as the public rallied behind her, Catherine remained silent, waiting for the right moment to speak. For Prince William, the crisis struck at the very core of his identity. A husband, a son, and the future king now forced to choose which crown to wear. As the storm raged around him, he was seen standing alone on the palace balcony, staring into the distance, his face lined with anguish. The man who had always embodied duty now looked like he was questioning everything it demanded of him. Below him, the whispers of revolt grew louder, and behind him, the walls that once felt unshakable now seemed to close in. It was only a matter of time before he confronted his father. According to palace insiders, that confrontation came late at night behind the thick oak doors of a private chamber, and all hell broke loose. Aides stationed outside reported hearing raised voices, William demanding answers, and Charles responding with cold fury. For years, William had deferred to his father's authority, accepting the crown as both destiny and burden. But in that moment, something in him shifted. Those who heard the clash described it as a son no longer begging for approval but declaring his own terms. Camilla, sensing the danger of this unprecedented rebellion, reportedly tried to intervene. She entered the chamber midway through, her voice sharp, as she warned William not to undermine the king in front of the staff, and not to fracture what was left of the monarchy. But her words fell on deaf ears. William, visibly shaking but resolute, is said to have told them both he would rather relinquish his titles entirely than continue watching his wife be humiliated and erased. One source claimed he slammed his fist on the table and said, "If she falls, I fall with her." Even their children were quietly moved out of sight during those turbulent days, kept far from the cameras, and even further from the whispers of betrayal echoing through the palace. "Shield them from this," William allegedly instructed his aides. "They'll learn the truth soon enough, but not yet." The tension within the palace was now undeniable, and yet William and Catherine's resolve only seemed to harden. Rumors began to circulate that the two were preparing something together, something that would not only defend their position, but shake the monarchy to its very core. The idea that they might emerge not as victims but as a united front, determined to confront the institution itself, sent shivers through the corridors of power. And just when it seemed the storm had peaked, Catherine reappeared, and delivered a blow that no one saw coming. With all eyes on her, Catherine emerged not as a victim, but as a force the monarchy had underestimated, and she came bearing truths the palace could no longer bury. In the middle of the chaos, when speculation had reached its peak and the royal household could no longer control the narrative, she appeared at an unannounced private press gathering. No fanfare, no royal aides directing the cameras, just Catherine, standing alone before the room, her expression steady, her voice low but unshakable. The reporters, who had come expecting platitudes, or perhaps even an apology, sat frozen as she began to speak. Her words cut through the tension like a blade. "There are things the world deserves to know," she said, her tone calm yet chilling, carrying the weight of something that could no longer be hidden. And then, piece by piece, she began to outline her truth. She spoke of betrayal within the palace walls, subtle at first, but deliberate and sustained. She spoke of manipulation, how her public image had been tarnished deliberately, how patronages she cherished had been stripped from her hands under false pretenses. And she revealed what many already suspected, but few dared to say, that there had been an orchestrated campaign to diminish her influence, a quiet but ruthless effort to push her aside without the world noticing. Yet even as she laid bare the darkness she'd endured, she spared a moment to speak of her family. With quiet resolve, she expressed gratitude for William and spoke lovingly of her children, describing them as her reason for standing firm. But then, with her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, she delivered a veiled warning that hung heavy in the room. "I will protect what is mine." Those 6 words sent a shiver through the press corps, a clear signal that this was no plea for sympathy. It was a declaration of war, if need be. Reporters who had come prepared with questions found themselves stunned into silence as she continued, hinting at evidence, documents, recordings, truths that she held in reserve, but was ready to release if provoked again. The words were not shouted, but their impact was deafening. Catherine was no longer asking for her dignity, she was taking it back. Within minutes of her departure, the press erupted. Newsrooms scrambled to broadcast her every sentence. Social media platforms lit up with clips and quotes, hashtags exploding across continents. Royal commentators, some with decades of experience, declared it a constitutional earthquake, the kind of reckoning the monarchy had not faced in generations. But while Catherine spoke with composure, the fallout from her revelations would prove far from over. As the monarchy reeled from Catherine's stand, the question on everyone's lips became impossible to ignore. Could the royal family ever recover? Or had the future queen just rewritten the rules forever? In the hours following her defiant statement, London seemed to hold its breath. Then, quietly but unmistakably, Catherine and William were seen leaving the city for Balmoral, hands clasped tightly, as though drawing strength from each other. Their silence spoke volumes, and though no words were exchanged with the waiting press, their unity was impossible to miss. It was clear now they were no longer just surviving this storm, they were steering it. Inside the palace, the chaos only deepened. King Charles reportedly called an emergency meeting with his closest advisors, demanding solutions that no one seemed able to offer. For decades, the monarchy had mastered the art of silence, of swallowing scandal, and sealing cracks behind the grandeur of tradition. But this time was different. Catherine hadn't just broken the silence, she had set it ablaze. And no amount of damage control could put out the fire she'd ignited. Camilla, once so composed, was seen leaving the palace through a side entrance later that evening, visibly shaken and refusing to answer the barrage of questions hurled at her. Those who caught a glimpse of her said she looked as though she'd aged years overnight, her once unyielding confidence replaced by something fragile and uncertain. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the world rallied around Catherine. Public opinion polls swung wildly in her favor within hours, with overwhelming support painting her as the victim of a system too rigid, too cruel, and too outdated to recognize her strength. Social media erupted into a frenzy of solidarity and speculation. Commentators began to whisper about what this meant for the monarchy's future, and whether the damage was repairable at all. Even among royal experts, there was little consensus. Some argued this was merely a storm the institution would weather, as it had so many before. But others insisted this was something entirely different from the dawn of a new era. An era where silence was no longer an option, where tradition could no longer strangle truth. The idea of a new monarchy, forged not by deference but by defiance, began to take shape in the minds of millions watching from around the globe. Because in the shadows of Ascot, it became clear that this was no longer just about a missed appearance, but the birth of a revolution. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.